use and love Wikipedia? Yes. Do we pay for it? In cash? That's more yeses than I anticipated. I love that. So, as we know, within seconds, it will tell us what year this building was built, by whom and how, and in 10 languages. But will it answer how this rich and valuable public resource should be funded in the future? We love the mission of providing free knowledge to the world. And anyone with experience from working in high-purpose environments, we know that money can be a bit of a dirty word. The negotiation does not come without drama, and Lane is here to share stories from the inner workings of Wikimedia and its commercial dilemmas. Perhaps there might be some insights for the intersection group. Who knows? Joining us from Austin, Texas, Lane is a designer, author, executive, and self-proclaimed token capitalist of Wikimedia. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I feel like we're in this. Oh, thank you. I once went to a conference where a guy named Jake Dunnigan, I'll just give him a shout out here, did this amazing 25-minute performance in which he stood up and then proceeded to have every single thing that could go wrong with the presentation go wrong with the presentation. Like the entirety of the presentation was just things getting sort of progressively worse. And it was sort of this amazing thing because for the first 10 minutes or so, the people in the audience were unbelievably uncomfortable. And then for the last 15, they were just laughing their heads off because eventually everybody got the joke. That is not what is happening here today. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit. So the topic that I want to talk to you about is somewhat about this idea of sort of the mission versus the money. But it is, I think, more broadly just about the challenge of trying to build something new and sustainable in something that already is something old and sustainable. And let me explain a little bit what I mean about that. So the reason I'm here talking to you about this today is because I do work for the Wikimedia Foundation. The Wikimedia Foundation is the large global, well, mid-sized global nonprofit that manages Wikipedia and its sister projects. When I introduce myself, I say, hi, I'm Lane, I work for the Wikimedia Foundation, comma, the large global nonprofit that manages Wikipedia and its sister projects, because for some reason we don't just call it the Wikipedia Foundation. It's a cute technology joke that has made introductions very complicated. Part of the reason for that, though, is because the Wikimedia Foundation does not just manage Wikipedia. It actually manages a variety of different projects, as we call them, all of which are designed at getting at what we refer to as the fundamental knowledge infrastructure of the world. So you don't just have Wikipedia, you also have Wiktionary, which is a dictionary. We have Wikisource, which does academic sources. We have Wikidata, which is a structured knowledge graph. There's actually many other projects beyond just those. And on top of that, we also do them in 300 plus languages. So I think there's 320 something Wikipedias that are there are 6 very large ones: English, German, Spanish, French, Italian, and Russian. But we represent any number of other languages that go beyond that. You can find smaller languages, indigenous languages from northern Canada, a variety of languages from central India have popped up recently. It's actually a really fascinating place to work because there is so much information, so many perspectives represented from so many different cultures. All of which means that we don't just call it the Wikipedia Foundation, we call it the Wikimedia Foundation. My job is working on this project. So this is a newish project that we have that's called Wikimedia, convenient to the topic of this conference, Wikimedia Enterprise. And Wikimedia Enterprise was started just about 4 years ago, and it is the for-profit subsidiary. So it is the part of the organization that doesn't just take donations, which you are all, I'm sure many of you familiar with, but actually makes money off of the sale of data to large technology companies. So what we do with Wikimedia Enterprise is we maintain an API platform that provides sort of robust data pipes to any technology organization that wants to use our data set. And it's a huge data set, and as many of you probably know, Wikipedia is edited by a wide variety of individuals. Some of you have probably edited it. Any person, more or less, can go in and edit any page in any language and participate in kind of this global cultural knowledge production effort. So I like to say there's just a ton of activity that happens, and then I'm just kind of working on a team that just has this sort of small pipe at the end that takes all that knowledge and kind of squirts it out into different places. A really good example of this is Google. Google is one of our customers, and you see Wikimedia data all over Google in a variety of different places, but the most common one is when you do a Google search in any language, you get what they call the knowledge panel in the upper right-hand side, which is an attempt to kind of guess at the basic set of information about what it is that you're searching for. And that knowledge panel, for the most part, is populated by data that comes from us. You can tell because there's usually an increasingly small, I must say, link to Wikipedia that shows up on that page. So that's what Google pays us for, is for that connection and access to that information. And then there's a whole bunch of other companies that do it as well, but that is what we do. It's an attempt to get revenue from these large tech companies in a way that is, like as you heard before, I like to joke that I'm the token capitalist. It's one of the few ways in which we actually make money that isn't donation-based. All right, so I actually want to talk about it. So what I discovered in putting this presentation together is that money is one of the aspects of what I like to talk about, but what I'm actually in some ways more interested in talking about is a slightly broader topic into which the money piece fits, which is this. When I came into Wikimedia and was asked to build this project, it wasn't like they said, go and build us an API platform that charges for data sales. The direction that we got was actually go figure out how to we recognize that these large technology companies are using more and more of our data. They're getting more and more value out of this data, but they aren't really paying back into our system in any meaningful way. In fact, what's really happening is we have a bunch of small dollar donors, and I should say the vast majority of the money that comes to Wikipedia comes from donations between $5 and $20, from people all across the planet, on many people on a year-over-year basis. But there's this recognition that, okay, these large technology companies are getting a ton of value out of us, but they aren't necessarily paying back into the pot. So the question they had for us was, how can you get money from them, right? And so that's actually turns out to be an incredibly challenging problem or situation for us, because one of the things you should know is we're kind of already giving them all that data for free, right? So one of the things about Wikimedia is that's our whole deal. We give information away for free. We are a nonprofit dedicated to this idea of giving information away for free. And many of the companies that we work with, Google included, had gotten quite used to using our data for free for many, many years. And so my job was to show up and say, okay, how do we do this? How do we bring this money in? So it's challenging for a whole bunch of reasons, right? One is I'm working in an organization that has a model that kind of already works. So I mentioned that we bring in money primarily between $5 and $20 from individual donors on a year-over-year basis. Last year we made $135 million off of people giving us money between $5 and $20, which is a lot of people. It's actually as nonprofits go, it's a very successful and frankly somewhat unusual model. We have online fundraising, we have banners, you've probably all seen them. They show up across the top of the page. They sound a little desperate. They always sound a little desperate. Make it sound a little bit like Wikipedia is about to collapse. It is not. But it's challenging, and so that's the model that we use. People come to our website, they see the banners, they give us money. I'm being asked to do something very different, right? They're saying, hey, we want to make money off of data sales, right? We want to make money off of the fact that we're sending this data somewhere else. People are no longer coming to our website, right? So there's a conflict right there. They're asking me to sort of make money in a way that actually detracts from our existing funding model. They don't want it to detract, though. They want it to be additive. So in design, and one of the challenges too beyond that was this recognition that our traffic growth is slowing down. because we've sort of so saturated the planet with Wikimedia data. Everybody knows it, everybody uses it, like it can't grow indefinitely. So there's actually sort of a slowdown in terms of the growth of the traffic, and there's a recognition as well inside the organization that we want to actually, like if our mission is to sort of spread information, we don't just want it to be on our website, we want people to use it in other places. We want Google to be able to use it, we want these other companies to be able to use it. All of which comes down to us in this project, and they were like, can you go figure out how to do this? And the answer was like, yeah, absolutely, we're going to try to do this. But in doing so, what we realized is that we're going to be challenging a lot about what the organization thinks about itself, about its mission, about how it interprets that mission, about what might need to change, if not necessarily about the mission or our values, but in how we execute on them. All of that kind of leads to this. All of this leads to sort of the bigger challenge. Now, in putting this presentation together, one of the things I realized is that this is actually a problem I've been thinking about for a long time. How do you not just how do you build something new, but how can you build something new in a way that works inside an organization where something is already working, right? Because if you think about it, well, you know what, before I get to that, let me explain why I suddenly have a picture of the American flag up here. My previous job, it turns out, I realized in putting this presentation together, it was actually very much a similar problem. So previous to working at the Wikimedia Foundation and working on this, I worked for the US government as a civil servant for a number of years, working in a technology transformation team called 18F. So 18F was, if you're familiar with the UK.gov and the UK Digital Service, was the United States' attempt to do something similar to that, to create a digital service. It started under the Obama administration. They had a couple of really spectacular technology disasters in the Obama administration and ended up hiring some folks to come in and fix it. And when they did that, they ended up building a couple of different institutions. One was called the United States Digital Service, and they built this other one called 18F. They named it 18F because they thought it sounded cool, and they thought they were more likely to be able to get sort of young kids with digital skills to come and work for the government if they named it something cool, like 18F, which actually I have to say was a very effective strategy. So 18F was like a technology transformation team inside the federal government. And I realized putting this presentation together, it's actually another great example of trying to build something successful inside another organization that is kind of already pretty successful. And while I know we all like to complain in many ways about how government doesn't work, for the most part, the thing about governments is that they do pretty much mostly work, right? And in fact, they have been working for a very long time, arguably, hundreds and hundreds of years in some cases. And so I worked for these guys. I put together, and when I was working for 18F, the project that I ended up doing, which we built, I think, somewhat successfully, was another project called 10X, because we just really got into this idea of like 2 numbers and a letter for new projects. So when I was working for 18F, I built 10X. I realized when I say that, it does sound a little ridiculous. 10X was an attempt to take, I should say I worked in the startup universe for a long time, and as a result of that, got to know a bunch of venture capitalists. Not my favorite people, but I did learn a lot from them about sort of how money works. And one of the things I was tasked with when I was at 18F was answering this question of how might we incentivize civil servants to build new products and services based on their knowledge of what did or didn't work inside the federal government. And what we ended up building was this project 10X, which was a funding structure based on sort of venture capital principles, but that helped civil servants figure out how to take their ideas, their experiences about what could work or how to improve the government, and turn that into technology products and services. A good example of one of the projects we did from that, which I think will probably be near and dear to the hearts of the designers in here, is something called the US Web Design Service. So this was a project that we funded and sort of successfully saw into the world, and now it's actually very much established in like policy documentation and legislation. And the US Web Design Service, the US Web Design System was a design system for the federal government. So the US government is extremely federated, many different agencies, lots of different folks, tons and tons and tons of different websites. websites. All of which, up until this showed up, looked differently, worked differently, didn't even have any way of consistently identifying what was an official US government website. So we were able to fund and build this design system, which was both fantastic from the perspective, it's a great system, it's very flexible, still allows and affords a lot of opportunity to show different kinds of your identity, but also creates a level of consistency. You can even see there's that little strip across the top that says an official website of the United States government, here's how you know. That shows up on most US government websites now, which was definitely not the case before this system existed. So we did cool projects like that, all of which were designed and funded through 10X, which again was like a venture capital funded model that allowed people to kind of come in and show what they had and what they wanted to do. All right, so a little bit more backstory, and I mentioned that one just because I've got some examples that are coming up from the government, as well as examples from my time at Wikimedia as I walk through how to answer this question. How do you build upon the success of an organization in a meaningful fashion without only replicating that initial success? Or to put it a little differently, how do you do something new inside a place that is still kind of running off the old thing and knows that it's working pretty well? So let's start with this. What makes an organization successful day to day, right? So this is like digging in, like where does an organization success? Something that is sustainably, functionally continuing to work. What makes it successful? I realize this is sort of a downer picture for, this is clearly someone who's not experiencing success. It's not the most exciting answer, but like what I realized thinking about where success comes from is success in organizations comes from sameness. Right? It comes from predictability, from consistency, from regularity. It comes from the same thing happening day in and day out. For most people, that's what work is about. It's coming in and doing the same thing tomorrow that you were doing today, right? Maybe you're doing it bigger, maybe you're doing it better, maybe you're faster, right? But fundamentally, you are trying to grow the same thing in some way, shape, or form. And this is obviously true for manufacturing work, but it's true for all of us. It's true for any of us that work in any industry, information industries, knowledge industry, design industry. We saw it actually just a minute ago when Milan was doing his presentation and was showing off those frameworks, right? In a sense, like that's what frameworks are about. They're about creating consistency. They're about creating sameness, So you make a playbook, you build a process, you write a manual, and then either you're implementing it yourself or maybe you're training others to do it, which is kind of what we have going on here. But again, ultimately, and I really want to stress this, it is about keeping things the same. Never was this more apparent to me than my time in the government as a civil servant, right? Because governments are quite literally the job of a government is to keep things the same from day to day because that is what people rely on, right? Like when you wake up tomorrow, when I wake up tomorrow, when any of us wake up tomorrow, like the job of government is kind of to make sure this whole place just keeps working in the same way that it already did, right? Like they want to make sure that the garbage gets picked up, you want to make sure that the street lights still work, you want to make sure that people stop when they're driving where they're supposed to, that people stay on the right side of the road. You want to make sure that property rights continue to exist so that you continue to own your home. You want the monetary system to continue to function so we can continue to exchange money for goods and services. Most of the time we don't think about this as something that is maintained, but when you work for the government, you learn, oh no, every single one of these things has people that get up every day and maintain that system. It is all about the status quo. Governments are effectively giant status quo machines. But organizations, corporations, they are also status quo machines in very much the same way. And yet, when we talk about business, we do not venerate sameness. Like, we don't make a big deal about sameness. Even when I'm sort of standing up here and talking to you about it, I'm like, wow, this is kind of a downer thing to talk about. We don't want to acknowledge, I think in some ways, certainly I don't, that a lot of what we do is just try and maintain, right? We want to talk to you, and certainly when people are talking about business, like, we mostly focus on change, right? Even when we talk about frameworks, we think about them as change management. We make a big deal about change, when it happens, how it operates. And so much of like business and the business press is about admiring people who do change, create change, support change. And I think nowhere is this more obvious than when people are in rescue mode, right? And sort of why I have the Superman picture. Like everybody loves the story of a good business rescue, right? Something terrible has happened, some disaster has befallen an organization, something is massively broken, but look, here is this person who showed up to save it. A hero is here to save the day, to save the kitten from the tree, to stop the building from collapsing, to rescue this disaster of a company from itself, improve the bottom line. So many biographies written about the kinds of people that do that, even though I think for the most part, for most of us, it's not necessarily the most useful information. And frankly, I've always been a little suspicious of our public love of that sort of thing, and particularly business heroes that rescue stuff, mostly because if you think about it, once you've hit rock bottom, it's not that complicated to figure out where to go next, right? When you're at the bottom, there's pretty much only one direction, and it's straight up. The situation with the kind of change we're talking about here, how do you build new upon new? How do you create something that's meaningful? How do you operate in a predictable way to change the course or the direction of something that's, again, kind of already working pretty well, right? So I'll take Wikimedia as an example. The reason that Wikimedia asked me to come in and build this was because they saw the writing on the wall, right? As I mentioned, our traffic's starting to level off, right? But the growth of our use of our data on the third-party side is actually pretty significant. Right? So it's clearly an area of opportunity for us. At the same time, we have a business model, and it is a business model, even though we're a nonprofit, that's designed to get people to come to our website. Because if you don't come to our website and you don't see those banners, you're not going to donate, right? So what they're saying is hey, we're looking a little bit in the future. We're not saying the thing is a disaster yet. We're saying that we can see where it's headed, that we need to start thinking about how to diversify our revenue sources. We need to start thinking about how we might be able to make money off of third-party reuse of our content, because the model that we have right now isn't necessarily going to work for us forever. That kind of change, I think it's harder than this kind of change, this sort of super-person rescue change, because you're not waiting for something to become a disaster before you fix it. You're trying to be proactive. But in doing so, again, you are going to really start to challenge people and what it is that they do, because they have their work life, their work history, their day-to-day activity. It's all built up around the stuff that we were just talking about. It's all built up around this idea of sameness, this idea that they are going to be doing the same thing day over day, and you are going to show up and maybe break that, right? So people are going to be scared of you. They're going to be scared of what you're doing. They're scared that you're going to break the machine that they've worked so hard every day to maintain. They're going to be scared that what you're going to do is threaten their job, that maybe it's going to threaten their identity if they really identify with that job, that it's going to threaten the role that they play and the thing that gives their work purpose. This is not great. You are not this guy. You are not the super person in their life. You are the bad guy, at least at first. The other thing I'll say about this is they're not wrong. This is something I've learned in this model. The thing about those folks who are scared of you and what you represent is there is a lot that can go wrong in the situation that I just described, the guy that took over this company did. Because everything I just described, in the broadest sort of, interpretation really fits what Elon Musk said he was trying to do at Twitter, right? He took this thing that was mostly working. He imagined himself to be some sort of swaggering hero. He came in and made some big changes, and then he just drove that thing straight into the ground, right? So on the one hand, I want to show up and say this is really important and fundamental work. At the same time, I want to say it can go terribly wrong, and it can get sort of harnessed to really unfortunate ends. As I mentioned, I've also worked in a lot of startups. That's part of why I ended up getting the Wikimedia job, was they were come build a startup inside the Wikimedia Foundation. And, there's this cliche in the startup universe, which venture capitalists really like to say. They like to say that it takes a different kind of person to start a startup than it does to run a successful startup. The reason they like to say that is mostly because they really like to fire the founders once things really get moving. But despite that, they're not wrong. It does take a slightly different mindset to maintain something than it does to create it. But I would argue there's this third mindset here. It does take a different kind of person also to effectively change a company, right? In a way that maintains its spirit, maintains its values, maintains its mission, while still fundamentally altering the kind of work that it does, or say, the way that it makes its money. So anyway, there's a lot of setup for today's presentation. I want to help you figure out how to be that person. I'm going to be more tactical about it. I'm just going to kind of give you some lessons learned as opposed to fun, fancy frameworks. The way that I think about this is not how do we build back from failure, but how do we build forward from success, and some of the skills that you need to pull that off. Okay, so I got 5 of them for you, and I'll move through them relatively quickly. First, 1 part precedent, 1 part vision. So this is a guy, oh, by the way, I should warn you, once you start working for Wikipedia, like the easiest default to do whenever you aren't sure what to do with a slide is just to put up a page from Wikipedia. So I warn you, I got a couple more of these in here. You saw one earlier. There's a few more. Okay, so this is a guy named Charles H. Duell. He was the commissioner of the US Patent Office at the tail end of the 19th century, so late 1800s. And I put him here because he has this thing that he said when he was the commissioner of the Patent Office. He's very famous for being wildly wrong. He said, this is again, late 1800s, he said, everything that can be invented has been invented. That was his stake as the head of the Patent Office. I think, we can all agree, maybe not. But I will say there is a seed of value in what it is that he's saying, because the best way to get started on something inside an organization is inside an old organization. The best way to start is to find something that is already working and repurpose it. Not start from scratch, but find something to literally build upon the success of past efforts and point them in new directions. In legal terms, precedent refers to this idea of taking an earlier event or action and using it as a guide for any future events or actions. Pretty straightforward. And what I'm referring to is that. It's the value of doing something new by using something old. Not a new concept in the design world, for certain. But this is really effective when you're trying to change directions, because it means you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from something people kind of understand, right? Something they're familiar and comfortable with, and then you're just adapting it or modifying it. Let me give you a couple of examples from my time working both with Wikimedia and in the government. So first, we were building from the Wikimedia side. This is the Wikimedia Enterprise API documentation. And when we were building Wikimedia Enterprise, we had this sort of interesting challenge, which was they told us, hey, you need to go off and sort of sell this data, right? We want you to go figure out how, all these companies are already using our data. We want you to figure out how to sell it to them, right? So it's already kind of a weird proposition. They're already using it. Go figure out how to sell it to them. And I said, cool, okay, well, obviously we need to cut them off. Right? Like, that's how this is going to work. We're going to cut them off so we can charge them for it. And they looked at me funny, and they were like, no, of course we're not cutting them off. I was like, okay, so proposition here is you want me to go figure out how to sell them something that we're already giving them for free? And they said, yeah, that's it. I was like, cool, okay. Anyway, my TLDR on this is people don't like to pay for things when you're already giving them to them for free. But we were like, okay, so how do we work with this? Well, what we decided to do is we're like, okay, well, how do we turn this into a benefit for us, right? The benefit for us here is that they are already using the data. And in some cases, like Google, had already been using the data for 10 plus years. So we thought, being good design researchers, so this is terrific. We can go in and we can actually sort of study what they're doing and figure out both what we can recreate from what they're already doing, but maybe make better, more effective, or faster. And we can also ask them what's not working for them right now, so we can figure out how to get them to pay for it. And that's really where this API platform came from. It came from talking to them about all the ways that they were already using the data and figuring out a way to build that in a more sort of functional, coherent, sustainable way. So we were able to use that information and that knowledge about what they already did, both internally and externally, to build this platform that was clear and recognizable to them. At the same time, we were also able to ask them a lot of questions about what was or wasn't working for them. And it turned out that a lot of them wanted business guarantees that they couldn't get, right? So if you're just using our free data, we make no guarantees. We don't it's pretty reliable, but we don't make any promises of reliability. We don't have a service level agreement that guarantees a certain level of uptime. We didn't have customer service. They didn't have anybody they could call, The Google folks would ping us before Enterprise, and they'd be like, hey, we need you to fix this thing. And the people at Wikimedia would be like, eh. and they just wouldn't do it. It's pretty hilarious, actually. So we came in, and what we did was we built that. We built a new platform. It was a little more modern, a little more functional, a little more designed towards the needs that we heard them stating, but we also just kind of made it feel like a business to them. We do give them customer support. We do give them professional services. We do give them a service level agreement that guarantees uptime. It's still a little bit of a climb to try and get them to pay because the core value is still the data, and we're still kind of giving that to them for free. But we were able to figure out through this, like, here's how we might be able to build something else around it. And in doing that, both externally it was valuable for our customers, but also internally it was valuable because people could see that what we were doing resonated with work they'd already done. The next thing I want to talk about is what I like to call the power of process and the friction of process, right? So process is a great and magical tool for making people feel like they're doing something right? Creating a process, it affords clarity, reliability, and certainty, especially in environments of deep uncertainty like the one that you're showing up with. I mention this because if you're working in a startup environment, like, process is the last thing that you want to talk about. Process is not a thing that startups like to deal with, but building a startup inside the Wikimedia Foundation was very much about building processes and giving people comfort with those processes. If you're working inside a process-driven organization, your best bet, just in general, is going to be to create, document, and enforce new processes that, like, capture the bulk of your desired outcomes. Again, this is very different from, like, how you'd work in a startup where you're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. In this case, when we were building stuff both inside the federal government and also the work that we did at Wikimedia, we're trying to make people comfortable with the changes that we were making. And what we discovered is that the way to make them comfortable with the changes we were making was to build process around it. They might complain about it, sure, but still, it was more carrot than stick for the most case. It would allow people to get stuff done in a way that they could see, that they could defend. It gave them clarity, certainty, and again, defensibility. My best example here actually does come from the US government. When we were building out the work that we were doing it by sort of taking over in a funding structure that had already existed. Again, that idea of, like, taking something old and repurposing it. So we found some money that Congress had already appropriated for government services. And we basically, in taking it over, discovered that we'd inherited this, like, immense financial mess. Right? Like, you want to think that governments spend money well? They do not. So we took over this thing and this appropriated fund. It was about $10 million. And they said, yeah, sure, you can use it for this new sort of venture capital style project. But first, we need you to kind of figure out what was going on before. What had been spent on, what the outcomes were. So what we did in order to do that was we created this process, right? It was a mess. We needed it to be less messy, so we created a process, a repeatable, templatized process for requesting that money, for dispersing money, and for reporting on our fund that was as clear and as straightforward as possible. This is, oops, sorry. There we go. It was pretty straightforward. As I mentioned, it works sort of like a VC fund. We take in the money. We had 4 phases. We give some money at the first phase. If they manage to sort of show the value of it, then we take them to the second phase. Fewer companies every time. You can see we got 181 ideas back in 2022. This project's still been going on without me. They selected 25 of those ideas to go to phase 1, where they got a little bit of money. From that, the 7 ideas to move to phase 2. This process made people really comfortable with the way that we were talking about the money and the way that they were able to spend the money. It gave us documentation and clarity. We were building a new thing. I mean, the idea of this kind of work, of spending money in a government in this way, of just, like, giving any civil servant that asks for it money to explore ideas, that was really bonkers to a lot of folks when we first suggested it. By putting it into a format that looked like this and having clear documentation and pushing people along, it made folks much more comfortable. The other thing I want to say, though, about the process approach is that there's a downside to it in all of this, and that is the friction that results. I mentioned before, startups don't really have to deal with this sort of process stuff and this kind of procedural work. The truth is, like, there's sort of a joy and a liberation in not having to do that sort of work. Just sort of sitting in a room with a team, real room or virtual room, and just kind of getting stuff done. You kind of mythologize that stuff in the startup universe, small team in a garage kind of thing. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. When you're trying to do this work inside a much bigger organization, it's all that you're still trying to work like that in some ways, but there's so much friction attached to it. There are all the processes of the larger organization that surround you, and managing your relationship to those is quite challenging. At Wikimedia, our team struggles under these all the time. I like to say, we're a 6-person team inside a 600-person team, and that organization is designed for a 600-person team, not a 6-person team, right? So we struggle with HR guidelines. We struggle with budgetary guidelines, you know? They want yearly budgets from us and predictability in how we want to spend the money. We want far, far less. We want far, far less of that, right? We want our team to be able to change on a dime because we're not entirely sure what we're doing, and sometimes people's roles need to shift. They want stable job descriptions. It's not unmanageable, this friction, but it's there. So something to be aware of if you find yourself in this situation. I would say that at this point in my job, 60 to 75% of my time is just managing that friction, and then the rest of the team gets to do all the fun stuff. Couple more. I know I'm short on time. I'll go fast. A couple more things. So one thing I will say is that there are 2 types of people who will try and stop you in an organization when you want to do this work. I call them the hard stops and the soft stops. The hard stops are in some ways more difficult but easier to deal with. The people that I call hard stops, these are people who have the authority to stop you from doing something and will in fact stop you from doing something. We'll call these the hard stops because they show up and they tell you, stop. When I was working for the federal government, and then frankly in almost every organization I've ever worked in, it was the lawyers. Lawyers are really good at being hard stoppers, right? Lawyers at the agency I worked in were no exception, right? I showed up with a new idea. They'd never seen that new idea before. They were like, no, pretty much everything that you want to do is terrible. We had to sign contracts with different teams called interagency agreements in order to be able to spend the funds. And wow, for the first couple years of our project, did they not let any of those contracts through. They just wouldn't. We tried so many things to get around that. Like, unlike in the private sector, where contracts are mostly about like telling you what you can't do, and in government structures, contracts are mostly about telling you what you can do, and they wouldn't let us do anything. We had to go through extensive legal review, and I couldn't get anything done. What we discovered, though, is that the thing about hard stops is that for the most part, they expect you to do one thing when they tell you to stop, which is stop. So the trick to dealing with hard stops in any organization is when they tell you to stop, to not stop. It's actually very straightforward. We tried a lot of different approaches to not stopping when we were trying to create 10x and get that project going. But what we discovered eventually is that the best way to get them comfortable with us was just to get them comfortable with us. We decided to befriend those lawyers. I spent so much time sitting with them in their offices, in coffee, going over documents and documentation. There was one lawyer in particular, I knew he really liked to go to the gym at lunch, so I would go to the gym at lunch too, so we could talk in a slightly less professional environment. What I realized is that really what I needed to get out of these people was their trust, right? That if I could get to a level of trust with them, then we would be okay. It took years with those lawyers to get them to that place. But by the end, it wasn't just that they weren't stopping us, it was that they were helping us, right? By the end of it, they were co-designing these contracts with us and co-designing contractual structures with us to help us get these projects through the pipeline faster. So while it was a lot of work, it definitely significantly lessened the amount. While it was a lot of work in the first 2 years, it significantly lessened the amount of work that we had to do the following 2 years. And I'm not saying it was perfect. We still lost a lot of legal battles, but at least we didn't feel like we were compromising our vision and we were actually able to get things done. Now, I mentioned there are hard stops. There's also soft stops. I want to talk about the soft stops because, frankly, they're worse. They are worse than the hard stoppers because these aren't people who actively have control over you. They're just kind of people inside your organization who just aren't into what you're. There are people in your organization who just aren't into what you're up to. That's fine, right? But then there are those who just don't like change, and they really don't like your change, right? For the most part, it's good if people don't like change. Too much change would be chaotic. But when you meet the folks in your org who are actively hostile to your change, they're the soft stops, right? These are people who have successfully climbed the career ladder by playing the status quo game better than anybody else. And you are the most threatening thing that is going to exist to their job, right? They don't like new ideas. They don't like unvetted ideas. They don't like that you're trying to claim any sort of authority space for them. I'm sure you folks have dealt with people like this in your careers. If what we were doing didn't work, they were afraid that it was going to blow back on them, right? And they were uncomfortable with that. They thought they are the folks who come in and see the work that you're trying to do to change as something that's going to get in the way. They might not have the power to kill what you're doing outright, but they do have the position and the authority to make life really difficult for you. And if they perceive you as a threat to their carefully managed career plan, they absolutely will. So these folks don't respond in the same way that hard stops do. Hard stops are like genuinely committed to the mission, right? Those lawyers, they saw the mission and they were trying to deliver on that mission, right? And we were just trying to get to a place where we could align on what that mission was. The soft stops, though, not so much. The soft stops were more attuned to like personal recognition and personal goals, and so orientation towards mission wouldn't get them to work. What works with soft stops is totally different. What works is just giving them credit for everything you're doing. And this can feel really painful inside an organization, especially when you're in a role like this one, but it 100% works. My experience with soft stops is give them as much credit as you can. And then the last thing I'll say, promise, the last thing is the last thing I want to say is what I call the long view and the short fuse. I came into government mid-career from the tech sector. I switched to a life of governments and nonprofits after working at startups for a really long time because I was burnt out by the pace and also by the futility, frankly, of the startup world. And I wanted to work somewhere that felt meaningful to me. I suspect many of us feel this way. But when I switched, I was still so used to working at startup speed. Right? And it took me a really long time to understand the blessing and the value of not working at startup speed. It's not the way it works inside of a government. It's definitely not how it works inside of a big, well-established nonprofit. I have come to really appreciate all of these things that I'm talking about, the multiple years that it took to convince lawyers to let me do something, the immense amount of time and energy that I put into our HR department and getting them to let me do things just a little bit differently in terms of the way that I do hiring so that it aligns a little more effectively with what I'm doing. The time that is spent just running around the organization, trying to figure out who to talk to next to convince them that whatever it is we're doing is a good idea and that they should allow it to continue, whether that's by giving them credit or by figuring out how to align with their view of the mission or whatever it might be. Just so, as I mentioned, 50, 60, 70% of my time at this point as the leader of these projects is spent doing that sort of thing. I mean, occasionally it feels like just figuring out who the next person to talk to is most of my job. And even 4 years in, that's still very much the case. Fortunately, I have a great team that's doing the actual work underneath me. But this is the work that I have to do to make sure that this thing like it's going to work. But I feel like it's worth it because this is how you embed something inside a status quo machine. And I think that's really important, right? Like the thing about working, I call these places status quo machines because that's what they are. Sameness is important. Defending the status quo is important. But the thing about this kind of work is that that's ultimately what you're trying to do. You're trying to take the thing that you've made and make it part of the status quo. Because then what happens is it's not just you defending this project, it's not just you running around and trying to figure out how to fit it in and who to talk to. Everyone at the organization is aligned around defending the status quo. And once the project you're working on becomes that, you're all set. Right? So this is the thing that I realized in working in these organizations. It takes time, but it's worth the time to embed what you're doing into the sort of warp and weft of the project you're working on. What was new and different soon just becomes part of the landscape. I call it the short fuse because my experience is that when you are the person doing this, you burn out pretty fast. So it's the long view is trying to get this thing to stick around as long as you possibly can. The short fuse is recognizing that you might not be the person who gets to stick around and enjoy it. And that is just part of the work. Throwing yourself against the machine day in and day out. It's a high burnout kind of activity. So if this happens, if you end up in a situation like mine and you end up doing this kind of work, I want to suggest that if you find yourself at the end of it totally burned out, that's not a failure on your part. It's just part of the success. Part of the success is figuring out how to let that thing go on without you, burying it in the machine and letting the rest of the organization take responsibility for it. And now, slightly over time, I just want to say thank you and feel free to contact me. I'll take some questions. I think we still have time.
First, a big round of applause. Thank you. This picture is everything.
This is my favorite. I love this picture. I took it like 10 years ago, and now I just use it for every conference I can.
Gorgeous. And this is also why we have long breaks at a conference like this, because that's where we will take our Q&A.
Oh, perfect.
So in respect of time, we will now stretch our legs. I didn't know this was going to be a sauna-themed conference, but I'm definitely feeling the heat, so let's go get some fresh air. That too. And when we come back, we have a choice. Either you join us here for 2 more talks before lunch, or you meet in the parallel room for a workshop with Sylvia and Curtis, and we will meet and resume at 10:45. See you in a bit.